We're nearing the end of this module, and you can skip this video here if React Native and Ionic doesn't tell you anything. These are simply alternatives to using Flutter, at least in a certain way. Flutter is not the only tool, the only approach that allows you to build iOS and Android apps with one programming language and with one project code base. There are other solutions too, also besides React Native and Ionic. There, for example, also is NativeScript and so on. But React Native and Ionic are probably the biggest competitors to Flutter. And I just want to show some examples on where Flutter differs from them. So why would you use Flutter and not React Native or Ionic? Now let's see how each of these approaches works. Flutter uses Dart and the Flutter framework, and Dart is a programming language developed by Google. React Native, on the other hand, uses JavaScript and the React library, and Ionic uses just JavaScript and any or no framework at all that you want. And by the way, I also do have courses on React Native and Ionic in case you want to have a look at that. Now, the result of Flutter is that you get compiled native apps. So you get real native apps compiled for the target platforms. For React Native, that's pretty much the same, but I wrote partly compiled here because the apps are compiled to native apps, but there also are parts in your code, in your JavaScript code, which is actually not compiled, but which is basically enclosed in the native app and runs as JavaScript in the native app instead of as compiled code. And that's different for Flutter. There, all the code is compiled and runs as native machine code, therefore. And for Ionic, nothing is compiled. There, you actually have a web app, which is wrapped inside of a native app. So you still get a native app, which you can publish to the app stores, but it's just a wrapper around your web app. Now, the advantage of this Ionic approach is that you can use normal web technologies, and if you're a web developer, it's particularly easy to create such apps, and you can use all your normal web development skills to build cross-platform apps there. Downside of this wrapped approach, of course, could be performance. Now, for Flutter, it's also important to understand that we don't compile to iOS or Android UI components, but that Flutter gives you an app that controls the entire screen and every pixel on it. For React Native, that's different. There, you do compile to iOS and Android UI components. So the parts of the React Native app that are compiled is in the end the user interface, and there, for example, if you render a button, it is compiled to the native iOS button for iOS and to the native Android button for Android. Which means you have less customization possibilities because, for example, if you can't add a drop shadow to the native iOS button, you can't add it to the React Native button because that's compiled to the iOS button. For Flutter, since it controls every pixel on its own, you can style it in whichever way you want, or Flutter lets you at least, because the native button restrictions don't matter to Flutter. Now, for Ionic, there is no compilation to native equivalents. Instead, you have a web app, so you can style a button as you could style it in any web app. It's not compiled to a native button. Now, with Flutter, you can build cross-platform apps, mobile apps, and actually even web apps and desktop apps, though as long as that's in very early stages, it'll not be part of the course. I do cover it once it is more stable, though. For React Native, it's pretty much only about mobile apps, though there is a project, an unofficial project, if you will, which allows you to use your React Native app also to get a web app as a result. For Ionic, you by default, since you build a web app that's wrapped by a native app, you by default have a web app as well, right? So you also have full cross-platform support. You can get a mobile app with this wrapped approach. You have a web app anyways, and you can also build a desktop app by wrapping it around this web app, so to say, with a tool named Electron. Now, who's working on these projects? Flutter is developed by Google, React Native is developed by Facebook, and Ionic is developed by a company which is called Ionic, and therefore they all have big companies backing them, especially React Native and Flutter, of course, but also the Ionic company is earning its money with the Ionic framework. And therefore, regarding the future, all three should be very stable and under active development for a long time. So that shouldn't influence your choice. What should influence your choice then? Well, for Flutter, there you have the great advantage that you have real native apps, so you get great performance. No web view wrapped app, which automatically has a bit worse performance because of that wrapping. Instead, you have meshing code, which is running, and that gives you a great performance. And because Flutter controls every pixel on the screen, you also have a high flexibility. You have a lot of control over your app. Now, some people also might not like this approach of not having the platform primitives, but instead have Flutter control everything, because you could argue that it's therefore harder to get the default Android and iOS look and that it requires a bit more work from your side to get the look. But that's up to you to decide. I think the higher customization possibilities actually aren't too bad and are a nice advantage. But in the end, that's of course up to your personal preference. React Native and Ionic are certainly nice alternatives, and that's why I do have courses on all of them. And attached to this lecture, you actually find a link to an article and a video which I created where I compare these alternatives and dig a bit deeper into the details of these approaches and give you a more detailed comparison. As a first summary here, Flutter is a great choice, of course, because you have real compiled apps, and with every pixel controlled by Flutter, you have a lot of flexibility and high performance.